Most people are waiting for the Antichrist to arrive. The Book of Enoch says you're too late. A text over 2,000 years old, quoted by name inside the New Testament, describes him not as a future tyrant but as a figure already among us, wearing a face you'd never suspect. Enoch doesn't leave you guessing who. He lists the marks, specific, repeatable signs that expose the pattern every time it appears. By the end of this video, you'll know each mark Enoch names, why the church stopped copying the warning, and how to recognize the figure when he's standing right in front of you. Enoch gets exactly 2 verses in Genesis before he vanishes. He walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. No death, no burial, no grave anyone could visit. Every other name in that genealogy closes the same way he lived. He had children, he died. Enoch is the one place the pattern breaks, and the text never explains it. It simply moves on, as if disappearing without dying were an ordinary way to end a life. For most of history, that was the entire story. 2 verses, then silence. But sometime between the 3rd and 2nd century BC, a set of writings began circulating through Judea, claiming to be Enoch's own account of the missing time, a first-hand record of visions he received before he was taken. Heaven opened to him. He watched a group of angels called the Watchers descend to earth and corrupt humanity. He was shown a courtroom scene at the end of history, complete with a verdict already written. And running through nearly every page is a warning about a specific figure of power that would rise, fall, and rise again across the centuries. This matters because Enoch wasn't some fringe text nobody in the Bible ever touched. The Book of Jude, sitting inside the New Testament right now, quotes Enoch by name, word for word. Enoch also, the 7th from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints." That's direct attribution, an author reaching for Enoch's authority the way you'd cite a source you expected your audience to already trust. For roughly 300 years, early Christian communities read Enoch alongside what would become the New Testament. Then the copying stopped. Skeptics are right that the popular story about one council voting Enoch out by name doesn't hold up. The real history is messier, a slow drift rather than a single dramatic ban. But the outcome was the same. The book early Christians treated as scripture-adjacent quietly stopped being reproduced in the West and survived complete in only one place, Ethiopia, inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which never removed it from its canon. A warning about a figure walking among us, preserved in the one corner of the world that refused to forget it. Here's where most readers expect a single villain, a future man, one individual with a mark and a countdown. But Enoch never describes it that way. In the section scholars call the similitudes, or the parables, the text introduces a recurring enemy Enoch calls the kings and the mighty, not fallen angels hiding in shadow. Human power at its peak, seated on thrones, backed by armies, convinced nothing on earth lies beyond its reach. George Nicholsburg, one of the most cited academic authorities on 1st Enoch, notes that the figures in this section aren't painted as Satan or as monsters or as some purely symbolic evil. They're described as corrupt political and religious elites, men whose power rests on their riches, who deny the Lord of Spirits outright, and who persecute the faithful who hang upon his name. Enoch's Antichrist was never one-horned individual waiting in a distant future. It's a pattern of earthly power that recurs, and recurs, across history. That's a more unsettling claim than a lone supernatural villain, because a pattern doesn't need one apocalyptic figure to arrive on schedule. It only needs power concentrated in the wrong hands at the wrong moment, something history has produced more than once already. A throne, a system, a ruling class that positions itself above judgment and treats every human being beneath it as reachable, ownable, disposable. And if the Antichrist is a pattern rather than a person, then the obvious question changes. You stop asking when he arrives. You start asking how to recognize him when he's already here. Most people assume a figure that dangerous would be impossible to miss. Enoch says the opposite. The pattern hides in plain sight precisely because it wears the face of legitimate authority, the ruler, the institution, the respected name, while running the same mechanism underneath every single time. Because a pattern that repeats leaves fingerprints. Enoch doesn't just tell us this figure exists. He lists the marks that give him away, the specific and repeatable signs that expose the pattern every time it surfaces. Not a symbol you scan for on the skin, not a number stamped on the hand. Something closer to a set of behaviors, a way of moving through the world that Enoch names directly, one after another. Those marks are where this turns from ancient history into something you can actually test against the world in front of you. Enoch doesn't describe this figure by his appearance. He describes him by his behavior, And the first mark is the loudest one. The kings and the mighty, Enoch writes, deny the Lord of spirits. Not quietly, not privately, but as a posture of rule. This is a figure who positions himself as the final authority, who acknowledges no throne above his own. That's the first mark, the denial of anything higher. A man who behaves as though judgment is something he hands down, rather than something he will one day stand under. The second mark sits right beside it. Enoch says their power rests upon their riches, not on wisdom, not on justice, not on anything earned by character, but on accumulation wealth used as the foundation of dominion. Strip the riches away, and the authority collapses, because there was never anything underneath it but the money. That's the second mark, a power built entirely on what can be counted, measured, and hoarded. Enoch treats this not as a neutral fact of leadership, but as a symptom of the pattern. The third mark is where the figure turns outward and becomes dangerous to others. Enoch writes that they persecute the faithful who hang upon the name of the Lord of spirits. The pattern doesn't merely ignore the righteous, it targets them. It treats the people who belong to something higher as obstacles to be removed. That's the third mark, active persecution of those who refuse to bow. The reaching toward the elect, which the whole book has been circling, begins here as hostility, as pressure, as the attempt to touch what isn't his. The fourth mark reaches back to the very beginning of Enoch's story, to the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers. There, a group of angels led by a figure named Azazel descend to earth and teach humanity forbidden things: weapon-making, sorcery, the cosmetics used for seduction, the tools of manipulation and domination. That lineage of false knowledge is the fourth mark. The pattern spreads by teaching people how to deceive, how to seduce, how to dominate. It dresses corruption as sophistication and sells it as progress. The fifth mark is the one that seals the others. Enoch's kings and mighty are convinced that nothing on earth could be beyond their reach. They place themselves above judgment, treating their own untouchability as a settled fact. That's the fifth mark, self-exaltation, the belief that dominion means immunity. It's the mark that makes the others possible, because a man who believes he can never be judged will deny the higher throne, build on riches, persecute the faithful, and spread false knowledge without a flicker of hesitation. Put those five together and you don't get a cartoon villain with horns. You get something far more recognizable. A figure who answers to nothing above himself, whose power is measured in wealth, who treats the faithful as enemies, who traffics in manipulation, and who believes himself beyond reach. Enoch insists this pattern is present tense. It doesn't wait for an appointed hour. It surfaces wherever those five marks gather in one place, in one throne, in one system that has forgotten there is anyone left to answer to. And this is where the story stops being a checklist and starts moving in real time. Because in chapter 62, Enoch shows the figure who bears these marks doing exactly what the third mark predicted, reaching for the elect. The Lord of Spirits addresses the kings and the mighty directly, almost mockingly. "Open your eyes and lift up your horns," he says, "if ye are able to recognize the elect one." It's a dare. Try to see him. Try to touch what belongs to him. Try, with all your marks and all your riches, to reach across the line. Most people picture what happens next as a kind of force field, a glowing dome, a visible wall the figure slams into and bounces off. Enoch's version is stranger than that, and worse for the one doing the reaching. There is no wall. There is only a mismatch. He is reaching for something that was never within his jurisdiction to begin with, the same way you can't steal an object that was never for sale. The marks that made him powerful over thrones and armies mean nothing here, because this was never his territory to enter. Enoch describes the collapse in physical terms. "Pain shall seize them," he writes. "The same pain as a woman in labor, the moment of birth becomes irreversible. Their faces go downcast. They cannot even hold a direct gaze on the thing they came to reach." The most powerful men on earth, the ones who spent entire reigns believing dominion meant untouchability, discover in that moment that the untouchable ones were never them. Every mark that built their confidence becomes the evidence against them, and the reaching they were so sure of turns, in an instant, into the thing that undoes them completely. Then it gets worse for them, fast. The kings and the mighty don't just fail to touch the elect. Enoch writes that they fall down before him on their faces and worship, and set their hope upon that Son of Man, and petition him and supplicate for mercy at his hands. The figure who spent the whole story functioning as the threat ends it, begging the very people he once had the power to persecute. Every mark that made him formidable becomes worthless in the space of a single scene. And the charge against him isn't vague. Enoch states the reason for his punishment directly. He is delivered over to the angels for vengeance, because they have oppressed his children and his elect. The reaching itself is the crime, not some separate sin committed elsewhere, not a private failing dragged into the light. The attempt to touch what belongs to another is the exact thing that condemns him. The third mark, persecution, turns out to be the mark that seals his sentence. This is worth slowing down on, because the language Enoch uses here isn't random. Remember the tree from earlier visions, the one at the summit of a mountain shaped like a throne that no mortal was permitted to touch until the great judgment. It wasn't guarded by a fence or a weapon. It was simply reserved, set apart for an owner who hadn't formally claimed it yet. Enoch uses that same word untouchable for a tree, and then again for a group of human beings. He chose it twice on purpose. There's a second reversal buried back in the Book of the Watchers that makes the pattern impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Azazel, the angel Enoch blames for teaching humanity weapons and seduction, doesn't get destroyed outright. He gets bound. The archangel Raphael is ordered to tie him hand and foot, throw him into a pit in the desert, and cover him with darkness until the day of the great judgment. The one who taught the marks is himself rendered unable to touch anyone, sealed away until the same day arrives. The reacher becomes the one who can no longer reach. Line those three up, and the shape becomes clear. The tree no mortal could touch until judgment. The elect no tyrant could touch until judgment. And Azazel, the source of the marks, made unable to touch anyone until judgment. In Enoch's world, power was never about who was strongest in the moment. It was about who had been granted the right to move freely once judgment landed, and who had already forfeited that right centuries in advance, without ever realizing the ground had shifted beneath them. Which turns the whole video back on you. Because if the Antichrist is a pattern rather than a person, and if the marks are behaviors rather than symbols, then the marks were never only a way to spot him out there. They're a mirror. Every one of them denying the higher throne, building on riches, persecuting the faithful, trafficking in false knowledge, believing yourself beyond judgment is a posture a human heart can take. The question stops being whether you can recognize him across the room. It becomes which side of the line you're standing on. That reframes the fear the whole video opened with. It was never really, will the Antichrist be able to touch me? It was, which pattern am I already inside, the one reaching for what was never mine, or the one already claimed by a name spoken before the world existed? The elect aren't protected because they're stronger. They're protected because they belong to someone, and belonging was never something a tyrant could reach across and take. Alignment, not strength, decides who stays untouchable. And that's a strange kind of comfort, because it means the marks aren't a life sentence. Enoch never describes the line between reachable and untouchable as fixed at birth. He describes it as something revealed, something a person is shown and then chooses to stand inside. The 5 marks describe the pattern of the reacher. The absence of them describes something else entirely. A person who answers to a higher throne, whose worth isn't measured in riches, who protects the faithful instead of hunting them. The mirror cuts both ways. But Enoch doesn't stop at recognizing the pattern while you're alive. He goes further, into a question most people never think to ask, because recognizing the Antichrist among us is one thing. Surviving what Enoch says comes for every soul in the moments right after death is another. According to Enoch, there's a trap waiting on the other side, one that has nothing to do with tyrants or thrones, and most souls walk straight into it without ever seeing it. That's the question the next video answers. And being able to spot the marks in life means nothing if you're unprepared for what's waiting after it.